some of the challenges in confronting the major issues of our time. Some not challenges in terms of facts, but challenges in terms of how we actually go about um, building something against them, building something positive, and also just building something against the power structures. Um, and with such massive issues, I'm thinking particularly about climate change. I think there's particular challenges that come along with that. And one of the main ones I think is sort of the lack of feedback that happens if you're trying to do something positive about them, trying to make something happen. There's the National Security Agency and things like economic inequality, which are massive by themselves, but climate change is really massive. It's going to take completely changing how we run our societies, how we run our economies, and how we plan our cities. It's a really huge challenge. And as someone who's confronted huge issues before that seemed hopeless at the time, like Vietnam, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how we can, as individuals and as groups, go about trying to organize and confront something as major as climate change when it can feel like you're pushing a giant rock and not getting anywhere. The problem of how you do something without necessarily getting positive feedback.
Well, you can't expect positive feedback from power systems. No, they have their own interests. Let's say take climate change. Canada is a good place to think about this. Canada used to be a pretty civilized society by comparative standards. Now it's becoming the scourge of the earth. It's partly Canadian mining operations, which are very destructive all around the world and are arousing great resistance among the victims, mostly indigenous people. But also the dedication to develop the most harmful forms of fossil fuels. Just this morning's newspaper, there's a discussion, and take a look at the business section of the New York Times. It discusses Canadian plans of Canadian corporations and the Canadian government to vastly expand the pipeline system to the west to aim for the Asia market and to the east so as to be able to reach directly to Europe and the rest of the world without going through the United States. And it points out that there are difficulties. At the West, there are problems with First Nations. The town where they wanted the major export terminal to be has voted strongly against allowing it to be used. The indigenous groups are struggling hard against it. This is typical. This tells you, first of all, it's partially an answer to your question. It also tells you something very interesting about the current world. Take, say, Canada, and this is typical. The richest, most educated sectors of the society with the greatest advantages are pressing very hard to escalate the threat of global destruction. The people who we consider primitive, in Canada, First Nations, in Latin America, indigenous people, in Australia, Aboriginal tribes, in India, tribal societies. They're the ones who are trying to retard the threat. And what's happening in Canada is typical. And it is a kind of an interesting, if you can separate yourself from the horrifying consequences, it's an interesting kind of paradox, if you like. But it tells you the answer to your question. It's urgent for those who have the most privilege, the most opportunity, the greatest advantages, to be in the forefront instead of in the rear in trying to impede what is likely to be a serious catastrophe. Again, take a look at this morning's newspaper. The lead story in the New York Times, other newspapers, is several scientific reports that just came out about Antarctic ice melting, West Antarctic ice melting. It's now pretty much determined that it's taking place and probably irreversible. And the predictions are that within several generations, it will start, it'll keep increasing sea level rise, but within a few generations it'll escalate very fast to about a 10-foot rise in sea level. Take a look at the world and ask what it'll be like with a 10-foot rise in sea level. Well, while we're looking at that, we see that in Canada and in the United States, those sectors of the population which have most power, most influence, most advantage are trying to race as fast as possible towards this destructive outcome. Meanwhile, First Nations and their counterparts elsewhere are trying to retard it. That's the answer. Popular forces just have to move up to the front and not accept what's being done in their name. And there's no big secret about how to do that. I mean, every possible every positive social change in history that I could think of has worked pretty much the same way. Grassroots organizing, development of popular movements, finally enough pressure on the centers of power so that they're compelled to respond. And that can happen. We don't live in totalitarian dictatorships. We're, by comparative and historical standards, they're very free to act. Sure, there'll be repression, that's taken for granted, but nothing like what's been faced in the past or is faced elsewhere. And therefore, it's really a matter of will and choice.
The situation is so big, though, and there's so many different avenues you could go about trying to work on the issue. And I think if at least for me, if you just focus on the facts of the matter, it's very easily to quickly feel paralyzed and not know how to move forward. And given, you've talked about when you were first getting involved with the Vietnam War, yourself and others would try to give speeches, and it would be to a tiny group of people, maybe basically just the organizers and one other person. You said at the time things felt completely hopeless, that it would be impossible, and you just kept going anyways. And so I was wondering what your thoughts on this for climate change are. I mean, do you think generally it helps to try to focus on one small area, even if it seems trivial in the vast scale of things, and try to work on that, or in order to get a sense of feedback and like you are having an impact?
Depends who you are and where you are. There's no single right answer for everything. There are some places where maybe the most important thing you can do is institute local pressures to support, say, use of solar power or wind power or weatherization of homes. There are other places where maybe the most important thing to do is to press for control over the plans to create pipelines and impede them. I mean, if First Nations can do it, there's no reason why people in Toronto can't. But there's simply no single answer. We have all kind of ways of. It's very different from the early Vietnam War movement. Then, as you mentioned, there was no support, and now there's pretty substantial recognition that there's a serious problem. Actually, some international polls just came out a couple of weeks ago. I don't think they included Canada, but I'm sure Canada would be in the mainstream spectrum. There's pretty high recognition in the population of the world that there's a serious problem. I think the highest that they found in the international poll was Brazil, at more than 3/4. The United States is below the norm, but that's for a simple reason. Partly you can see it outside this window, where you see the Koch Cancer Center. There's a huge propaganda campaign, perfectly public, nothing secret about it, by major sectors of the corporate system, energy, American Chamber of Commerce, others, working really hard to try to convince people that either there's no global warming at all, or if there is, humans have no role in it. That has had an effect on the population. It's below the global norm, and it's interestingly stratified. So if you break it up, when the polls break it up into Democrats and Republicans, the Democrats are somewhat below the global norm. Republicans are off the planet. They're way down at the bottom. And they are the ones who are It's the party that's former party. I wouldn't even call it a political party anymore. That's lockstep dedicated to the service of wealth and power. And for them, what happens in the future just doesn't matter. I mean, you have to recognize that in the moral calculus of North American state capitalism, the fate of your grandchildren amounts to essentially nothing as compared with the need for profit tomorrow. Now, people can understand that. It's not like the anti-war movement. The majority of the population already understands it. The point is to get them active, energized, all kinds of ways, protests, sit-ins, takeover of buildings, whatever it takes to try to make it possible for our near descendants, it's not very far off, to have a chance for a decent living. That's a pretty straightforward message.
One of the things you always point out is, if you were asked before the civil rights movement, would it make sense for someone to stage a sit-in at a counter? You would have said probably not. And same with the Occupy movement. If people asked you, should you, have a camp-in at Zuccotti Park, you'd have said, be a waste of your time. And I guess one of the main issues is we never know what's actually going to work. Sometimes we can, despite our best efforts, it might even be a pushback where we actually lose ground. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on how does one keep forward or keep going in the face of not knowing if the tactics that you are pursuing are even worthwhile or not?
Well, as you've just indicated, I'm probably the worst person to ask because my judgment has often been wrong. The first case you mentioned was the Greensboro, North Carolina, a couple of black students sitting in at a lunch counter. My assumption when I heard about it is this is going to be smashed instantly. Turned out to be a spark that set off a huge popular movement. Occupy, unfortunately I wasn't asked, but if I had been in Zuccotti Park, I would have said, you're wasting your time. Turned out not. Sometimes I think my judgment isn't right, other times not, but the point is you really don't know. So how do you keep going? You consider the alternatives. The one alternative is to say, look, I don't know if it's going to work, so I'll do nothing, thereby helping ensure that the worst will happen. Now, the other possibility is to say, look, I don't know whether it'll work, I'll use my best judgment. If my best judgment is, look, there's a chance it'll succeed, I'll try.